In this project, we'll see how to create a watercolor wash effect using only a few well-placed art brush strokes. I've recorded the entire process, and I'm just going to narrate over top of it from start to finish. So there will be some times when I'm not talking at all. Okay, let's get started. I've made a really basic line drawing using a calligraphic brush. There it is in outline mode. And I've also created a color group with various landscape color swatches. The drawing is made of this calligraphic brush, and I've put it on a separate layer, which I'm going to lock. I've also created a simple gradient for the sky and put it on its own layer, and I'm going to lock that as well, and then just use one layer for the brush strokes. I'll double-click the paintbrush tool to bring up its options, and I'm going to turn off Edit Selected Paths, but I do want to keep the paths selected. I want the strokes to be fairly loose, so I'll turn up the fidelity and the smoothness. I have a few art brushes loaded in my brushes panel, and I'm going to select this medium brown, then I'll change the stroke color to that, and I'll just paint a stroke on this back mountain. I'm going to go up to the control panel and increase that stroke weight to 10 points, and you can see that we start to get kind of a wash effect. I'm going to open the transparency panel and change the blending mode to multiply. With this path still selected, I can go over it with my brush tool to edit it. I can also use any of the editing tools, such as the direct selection tool, to change the shape of that path. I want to fill in this mountain area, and the stroke weight is a little too high, so I'm going to move that down to 6. Now I'll just keep painting a couple more brush strokes. I can experiment with different brushes and different point sizes. But because these brushes already contain transparency, and they have that blending mode applied, they interact with one another, just like real watercolor would. Now I'll do this darker shoreline, and as before, paint some more brush strokes and adjust their sizes. I'll experiment with different brushes and different colors, and now I'm going to paint this shore over here. So once again, I'm going to go up to the control panel and increase the stroke weight to, let's say, 16 points, and experiment with other brushes. That one's a little out of control, so I'll choose this one. I can also look for some more brushes under the brushes library, and I'll pick a few artistic watercolor brushes to add to my panel. And you can see with that large point size that you get some really interesting effects. I'm going to use the smooth tool by holding down the option key and smooth that path, and I'll make that brush stroke a little smaller, 8 points, and then I can also adjust it with the bounding box. So the key here, just like with real watercolor, is to kind of let the stroke do what it wants. You don't have to get too specific about it, and modifying the paths gives you some pretty random results, and that's what we want. I'm going to take the warp tool and warp that stroke, just as you might do with a real paintbrush. If you had some wet watercolor, you could continue to move it around before it dries. Now I'm going to paint the water using a blue brush stroke, and I'll rotate it and move it in place. Again, I'm trying to work quickly here and not get too caught up in being too exact. I want to move this stroke over to this sort of inlet here, and then I'll draw a few more strokes for the water. Again, I'll use the warp tool to kind of move that in place, and that gives us some interesting effects as well. I'll do a couple more water brush strokes and experiment with different brushes and point sizes. And of course, the advantage to doing this in vector is that these are objects that you can move around freely without any destruction in the quality. Now I'll choose this green stroke and add a little foliage here over on the left, and again, keeping it really abstract and loose. I'm going to choose this warm brown and make some strokes here on the foreground. This will warm it up and give it some more texture. Most people might think of Photoshop or Corel Painter when doing something like this, but again, you have these individual vector objects that you can move around freely. If you were doing this in Photoshop, you'd have to create a separate layer for each brush stroke to get this kind of flexibility. Also with vector, you can add or delete points to the strokes for different effects. Now I'm going to paint some clouds in the sky, so I'll change my brush stroke to white, and then I'll paint a stroke in the sky. I'm going to increase the point size, and the reason I can't see it is that I have my blending mode set to multiply. So I'm going to change that to screen and turn down the opacity just a bit. I think I have to decrease the point size on this, and I can rotate that so it looks more like a cloud. I can experiment with different brushes, and I think actually I like this one better. And I'm going to go ahead and warp this stroke, and that's going to give me some more cloud-like effects. Now I'll hold down the Option key and smooth out some of those points because I want this to be pretty simple. I'll draw one more cloud shape, change its point size, and move it into place. I think this one is still a little too big, so I'll decrease that point size, and that's starting to look like a cloud, so I'm going to rotate that up, just like so. And I'll just move it over a little bit. So this only has a few brush strokes, as you can see in outline mode, but the effect is pretty cool. I'll turn off the drawing and sky layers so you can see just those strokes. There's only about 15 of them. And just like with real watercolor, you want to stop before it gets too muddy. This might make a nice background to add other more detailed vector objects on top of it. Here's a more complex painting that I made using a sketch of mine from the Grand Canyon. I used Live Trace for the sketch, and then I put it on its own layer, and I've added some brush strokes, as we just saw, to create the watercolor wash. To add to the watercolor effect, I used an ink splat scatter brush just for some random green color that looks as though it were flicked on with a real brush. This is a fun and easy technique that can yield interesting results with only a few strokes.